I was cleaning the drawers in the hallway when I found it, a photo tucked between the pages of an old user manual for the air conditioner. It must have slipped there years ago. The edges were slightly curled, the colors faded, but the woman in the picture, laughing, her head thrown back, shoulders bare under a sundress, was unmistakably me. Younger, yes. Less refined. But alive in a way I could no longer recognize. My husband passed by just then, balancing a toolbox in one hand and a coffee in the other. He glanced over my shoulder, smiled with that familiar blend of fondness and practicality. "You were always beautiful," he said. "Now you just look more grounded." Then he turned into the bathroom to fix the faucet, the photo forgotten as quickly as it had reappeared. I sat there longer than I meant to, staring at the version of myself who had once believed she could have everything: joy, sensuality, freedom, purpose. Not the carefully planned routines and layered responsibilities I'd grown into. Not the late dinners, reheated in silence. Not the polite kisses on the forehead before sleep. There was nothing wrong, and that's exactly what gnawed at me. The doorbell rang. I didn't get up right away. The photo was still in my hand when I opened the door to him, my husband's closest friend. He smiled casually, that effortless charm of his like a familiar scent from another life. His visits weren't rare. He was part of our circle, part of our weekends, part of our wine nights. But lately, I'd begun to feel his presence like a thread pulled too tight under my skin. He stepped in and glanced down at my hand. "Memory lane?" he asked, eyes darting toward the photo. I nodded, tucking it into my pocket, suddenly protective. He chuckled. "You laugh more back then. Used to make it hard to focus on anything else." I should have replied with a joke, a brush off. But instead, I looked at him too long, something unspoken settling between us. I turned away first. We sat in the kitchen, the usual clink of mugs and hum of the kettle filling the space. My husband joined us briefly, spoke about the hardware store, about ordering new blinds. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when I had to, but I kept seeing that old photo in my mind like a ghost leaning over my shoulder. Later, after my husband went to the garage, his friend lingered by the window. We were alone for just a moment too long. I could feel his presence without looking, the quiet way he noticed things, the way he sometimes didn't speak unless what he had to say mattered. "You okay?" he asked finally, voice low. "Careful." I hesitated. The kettle whistled. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." But that wasn't it. I wasn't tired. I was hollow. And I was beginning to realize that I didn't miss sleep. I missed touch. Not the routine gestures of a man who loved by providing, but the kind that lingered, explored, anticipated. That night, when we were getting ready for bed, I told my husband the faucet was leaking again. He frowned, then promised he'd fix it the next morning. I nodded, changed into my sleepwear in silence. He reached out and brushed my shoulder, a habitual gesture, then turned off the lamp and rolled away. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, replaying the way the friend had looked at me, curious, hesitant. A flicker of something that felt dangerously close to hunger. It wasn't a moment. Not yet. It was just the breath before it. But I knew, somehow, that a line had shifted. Not crossed, but drawn. Subtle, quiet, irreversible. And I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake. I didn't ask why he was really there. I didn't want to know if it was coincidence or fate. It didn't matter. What mattered was the electric stillness between us. The way every glance, every breath felt preloaded with everything we hadn't said. I stopped beneath a low tree, the shade cool against my skin. "I wore it," I said quietly. He looked at me, confused. "The lingerie," I clarified, barely louder than a whisper. His breath caught. I saw it. The recognition, the hesitation, and then something deeper. Not hunger, not triumph, but something that resembled pain. A tenderness that surprised me. "You shouldn't tell me that," he said. "I know." We didn't kiss right away, not the way you expect it to happen. It wasn't a fevered collision, not the desperate grasp of two people cheating time. It was slow, devastating. A question asked in the form of a mouth brushing against another. A pause, then another, until the ache outweighed restraint. His hand found the small of my back. My body arched into him, instinctive. He tasted like coffee, and the beginning of something I couldn't name. There was nothing rushed, nothing stolen. Only two people finally doing what they had almost done in silence 100 times before. When we pulled apart, we didn't speak. We simply stood in the shade, breathing unevenly, the ocean hidden behind us, and the hotel too close. Later that night, back in our room, I dressed slowly. My husband had returned from dinner early. He asked if I wanted wine. I nodded. I wore the dress, the green one. He whistled softly when I came out of the bathroom, called me stunning. I smiled, adjusted my earring. He didn't know that the lingerie beneath the silk wasn't worn for him. He didn't know how my skin still hummed from a kiss I hadn't been supposed to have. He reached for my waist as we walked out the door, his hand resting exactly where another had hours earlier. And all I could think was how warm his touch used to feel, and how unbearably cold it had become. Back home, the quiet returned with a vengeance. It didn't soothe me this time. It suffocated. The trip had shifted something that could no longer be unshifted. It wasn't the kiss alone. It was everything surrounding it. The tension, the awareness, the thrill of being seen not as an extension of someone else, but as a woman whose hunger hadn't died, only been silenced too long. I brought all of that home with me. It followed me through the customs of marriage, laundry loads, dinner prep, weekend planning. As if those rituals could still contain the version of me that existed now. My husband had become lighter after the trip. He believed, perhaps, that the weekend had helped, that the green dress, my hand on his arm at dinner, my willingness to travel again, these were signs of rekindling. He started waking earlier, making breakfast. He suggested we take a short trip to the coast, next month, just the two of us. He even tried to be physically tender again, gentle caresses at the small of my back, soft kisses in the early morning before a shower. Once, he left a note near my coffee cup that said, "You looked radiant this weekend." I stared at the word radiant for several minutes. I didn't recognize myself in it. Or maybe I didn't recognize his version of what it meant. The problem wasn't that I didn't care for him. It was that I couldn't feel myself in the way he touched me. I couldn't breathe in his rhythm anymore. His affection came from a place of comfort, of habit, and I was no longer living in habit. I was floating somewhere between guilt and awakening, between memory and desire, unable to fully return to the version of me he still believed in. I tried, out of fairness. I let him undress me one night. He lit candles in the bedroom, thinking it would stir something sensual between us. And I lay there, letting his hands travel my skin like a familiar map, but all I felt was the absence of that earlier burn. The pulse that lived in the unexpected. His touch was safe. It didn't make me tremble. It didn't make me hold my breath. It made me disappear. Afterward, I curled up facing the window, eyes open, feeling lonelier in the presence of love than I ever had in its absence. I didn't cry. I just folded myself smaller and listened to the rhythm of his breathing as he drifted into sleep beside me. Content. In the days that followed, I became more deliberate. I chose my clothes with a quiet purpose, not to seduce anyone, but to keep the sensation of awareness alive. My lingerie drawer, once a graveyard of forgotten silk and lace, became relevant again. I wore perfume at home. I started brushing my hair a certain way, putting on lipstick even when I wasn't going anywhere. I told myself it was about reclaiming my sense of self. But I knew what I was really doing. I was waiting. Not actively, not in desperation, but in the way the body waits for weather to change, sensing it in the air, in the light, in the invisible shift of temperature before a storm. We hadn't spoken since Santa Barbara. Not even a message. Not even a look. But I felt him everywhere. In my reflection. In the clothes I chose. In the way my fingers hovered too long over the coffee cups at the store, remembering how he sipped his black with no sugar. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found my husband unloading groceries. He held up a bottle of white wine, a brand I liked years ago but had since forgotten. He said he thought it might go well with fish for dinner. I thanked him.
Smiled even.
and opened the fridge to put it away. Then I asked, almost without planning, "Do you think we've changed?" He looked up, surprised. "Changed how?" "Just changed. You and me." He walked over, leaned against the counter, and tilted his head slightly. "I think we've grown. Settled. Isn't that normal?" "Normal." I nodded slowly and turned back to the fridge. That word wrapped itself around my chest like a band. Settled. As if the final goal of love was stasis, not electricity. That night, I lay in bed alone, while he worked in his home office. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning its soft rhythm above me. My body was still. My mind wasn't. I thought about the garden at the hotel, about the warmth of a hand on the curve of my back, about the way my name sounded when said with restraint instead of routine. I thought about how being wanted didn't fix anything, but how it reminded me I was still capable of being wanted, and how deeply I needed that reminder. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't send a message or find a reason to drive past his building. I just waited, quietly, in the low hum of this new in-between, where my marriage continued on its rails, steady and unquestioning, and my heart slowly turned towards something that hadn't even asked for it. And I knew, somehow, this wasn't going to fade. It was only the beginning of the fracture. And soon, the silence would start to crack. I opened a book I'd been meaning to start for months, turned 2 pages, and closed it. I thought about calling a friend, meeting someone for lunch, even walking downtown, but all of it felt performative, like I would only be doing it to distract myself from what I couldn't say out loud. I missed him. Not my husband. Not the comfort of my old life. I missed the man who had looked at me and seen a hunger I hadn't yet acknowledged in myself. I missed the friction, the barely held control, the moments before and after touch, when breath became uneven and the world narrowed to the space between skin and memory. In the afternoon, I pulled the lingerie from the drawer and held it in my hands. The fabric felt lighter than I remembered, as if it had become part of me. I didn't put it on. I just held it there, letting my fingers run along the lace. Then I folded it gently and put it away again, like preserving something sacred. The hours dragged. I opened a bottle of wine too early. I stood on the back porch and let the sun heat my skin through the fabric of my shirt. I thought of how he'd looked at me the last time we were alone. Thought of how his hands hadn't shaken, how he'd held back with more force than most men used in pursuit. The sun dipped lower. The house grew darker. I didn't turn on the lights. And then, as if drawn by some thread I couldn't see, I reached for my phone. I typed the message slowly, pausing after each word. I can't pretend anymore. I don't want to. My finger hovered over the screen for a long moment. I didn't weigh the consequences. I didn't imagine what would happen next. I didn't craft a second message to soften the blow. I pressed send. The response came sooner than I expected. "I've been waiting for you to say that." I let the phone fall onto the couch beside me and stared out into the fading light. My body felt electric, not with excitement, but with certainty. There was no plan, no escape route, no dramatic declarations, just truth. Bare and impossible to take back. The silence in the house changed. It was no longer heavy. It was filled. Later, lying in bed, I imagined the lake. I pictured them side by side in the boat. Quiet, laughing over old jokes. I wondered if he had stepped away to message me, if he had looked up at the same sky, knowing that on the other end of the signal I was lying here, heart open, no longer pretending. And in that silence, I understood something terrifying and clear. This was not about lust, not about rebellion. It was about becoming someone I hadn't let myself be for years. And I wasn't going to let her disappear again. I didn't leave, not in the way people expect when stories like these unravel. There was no suitcase packed in a rush, no dramatic exit at dawn. But something inside me had already crossed a threshold. And I knew, whether I admitted it aloud or not, that I would never be able to go back to who I had been before. After I sent that message and received his reply, I stayed in that stillness. I didn't respond. I didn't plan a meeting. Didn't suggest a time or place. I simply let the truth settle inside me like ink in water, slowly staining everything it touched: the walls of my house, the quiet drawers of our shared life, the smile I put on when I ran into neighbors or exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store. Everything I said began to feel like a performance, and yet I had never felt more honest. The day after their return, my husband walked in with the same worn duffel bag and the smell of lake air on his jacket. He was sunburned and relaxed. There was a lightness in his voice, the afterglow of male companionship and a successful getaway. He talked more than usual that evening, telling stories from the trip, jokes I had heard versions of before. He poured us both glasses of wine and grilled steaks on the back patio, like it was the beginning of something new. I listened. I nodded. I smiled in the right places. I looked at him the way a person looks at a distant city from an airplane, recognizing the shape of things, the familiar outlines, but no longer feeling the streets beneath their feet. I noticed how his hair had grayed a little more around the temples, how the lines around his eyes deepened when he laughed. I remembered how I used to touch those lines without thinking, how now I could barely imagine my fingers reaching for him without effort. Later that night, when he touched my back in bed, it wasn't unexpected. His hand was warm, his breath steady. He kissed my shoulder and murmured something quiet, his voice low and intimate. I turned toward him, and for a moment I allowed it. I let him kiss me, let his mouth trace the hollow of my throat. But the sensation was muted. My body responded with the obedience of routine, not desire. There was no spark, only echoes of what used to live here. I pulled away gently, saying I was tired. He accepted it without question, rolled over, fell asleep. And I lay in the dark, eyes wide, feeling the way my skin had flinched beneath his touch, not in rejection, but in recognition. Recognition that it was no longer his to claim, that the part of me that had once reached for him without thought had shifted its allegiance. In the following days, my habits changed. I didn't tell him where I went when I left the house.
He didn't ask.
I spent more time preparing myself in the morning, not for appearances, not for others, but for clarity. I needed to feel sharp, real, intentional. I began to walk longer routes through town, past places I used to visit before marriage, before routine had carved its steady path. I went into stores just to touch the fabric of dresses I might never wear, smelled perfumes I had long since given up on, wrote lists in notebooks with no intention of completing them. Everything became about feeling. One afternoon, I stood in front of my closet and ran my hands along the row of clothes I had worn over the past decade. Safe colors, practical cuts. Nothing too tight, too bright.
To anything.
I reached to the back, where I kept the dress. The green one from Santa Barbara. I took it out and laid it on the bed. Then slowly, I undressed, slipped into it again. Bare feet against hardwood. The zipper whispering at my back, like a promise. In the mirror, I studied the woman I had become. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't a victim of temptation or a cliché of midlife unrest. She was someone who had spent years living with a muted heart and had finally heard its voice again. The phone buzzed once. A name.
His. Can I see you?
I didn't respond immediately. I looked at myself longer, at the way the fabric shaped my spine, the curve of my waist, the soft tension in my shoulders. I thought about the risk, about the fallout, about the guilt that had dulled into something more complicated. Then I replied, "Not tonight, but soon." There was no fire in my veins, no reckless thrum of adrenaline, only the steady beat of inevitability. Not because I needed to feel wanted, but because I needed to feel true. The next morning, I sat across from my husband at breakfast. He read the paper, made comments about the stock market. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the swirl of cream disappear into brown. He looked up once, met my eyes. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. Yes. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't lying. I wasn't okay in the way he meant, in a way that meant everything was fine and would stay the same. But I was okay in a different way. I was becoming someone who could no longer accept pretending as peace. I didn't know how this would end. I didn't yet have the shape of it. But I knew I wasn't waiting anymore. I was moving, and soon I would choose where. There was no announcement, no suitcase near the door, no confrontation, no trembling hands, no trembling voice. It didn't happen like it does in stories or films. What came instead was the quiet erosion of pretense, a long, slow undoing, thread by thread. The morning I decided to tell him, the house was still. Outside, the sky was flat and gray, the kind of sky that demands nothing from you. I moved through the kitchen as I always did, made coffee, sliced fruit, wiped the counters though they were already clean. I wasn't afraid. That part had already passed. The fear had been replaced by a deeper weight. Certainty. He came downstairs in his usual quiet way, already dressed, already skimming through news on his phone. He kissed my temple distractedly, took his coffee, sat down, and began reading aloud an article about the housing market. His voice was calm, assured, belonging to a man who believed his life was intact. I let him finish. I let him sip his drink and fold the paper just so. Then I said it, not all at once, not with cruelty. I said it with the same tone I might use to describe the weather. Steady, unapologetic, clear. I've changed. I don't want to stay in this house anymore. He looked at me for a long time, the paper slowly lowering in his hands, the weight of what I'd said filtering through layers of shock. His face didn't twist into anger. His voice didn't rise. He simply stared, blinking, as if he hadn't quite heard me correctly. But he had. He understood. What happened? He asked finally, his voice dry, almost brittle. I could have lied. I could have said I didn't know, that I was confused, that it wasn't about anyone else. But he deserved the truth, not the full anatomy of it, not names, not nights, not moments pressed into memory, but the truth of what had died between us. I don't feel like myself here, I said. I haven't for a long time. He nodded slowly, set the coffee cup down. There was a tightness in his jaw that he didn't try to hide. But still, no anger, no pleading. He looked away for a moment, then back again. Is there someone else? I hesitated. And in that pause, everything was said. He looked down at the table, exhaled once. Deep and quiet. I watched the realization move through him. Not like a wound, but like a cold front settling into the bones. A change he couldn't prevent no matter how much he might have tried. He didn't ask for details. He didn't accuse. He simply nodded again, stood up and walked out of the kitchen. I stayed where I was. The silence after the conversation was deeper than the ones that came before it. Not heavy, not sharp, just final. That afternoon, I didn't pack anything. I didn't rush to call him, the man I'd been thinking of all this time. I didn't go to him as if he were a refuge or a reward. I stayed home. I opened windows. I moved through each room slowly, touching familiar objects like they belonged to someone I used to be. The air smelled different somehow, cleaner. Or maybe it was me. When night came, I showered. I chose my clothes carefully, nothing extravagant, nothing revealing. Just a soft dress, loose around the shoulders, easy to move in. I applied a hint of perfume, a gesture not for seduction, but to mark the moment. I didn't text him. I drove. The city lights blurred through the windshield as I moved through the streets, each turn deliberate, each red light a moment to breathe. I parked 2 blocks away, walked the rest on foot. My heels clicked softly against the pavement, the night wrapping around me without resistance. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised. He didn't smile. He stepped aside and I entered. The apartment was quiet, dim. No music. No staged atmosphere. Just us. I stood in the center of the room for a long moment, my eyes adjusting. The air between us was thick, not with tension, but with inevitability. He didn't reach for me. He waited. I told him. I said. He nodded. We didn't rush toward each other. There was no crashing together like scenes from melodrama. We moved slowly, carefully, like people who understood the weight of what they were carrying. When our hands met, it wasn't passion. It was recognition of the ache, of the risk, of the strange, quiet relief that came from stepping fully into what had been haunting us for months. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because of nerves or uncertainty, but because my body wouldn't let me miss a second of stillness, of quiet breathing beside someone who had for so long existed only in tension and denial. I watched the ceiling, listened to the rhythm of night outside the window, and felt something unfamiliar.
Peace.
In the morning, I left before sunrise. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say I'd come back, but I knew that I would. Not because I had found a replacement for what I left behind, but because I had finally found myself, and she was never going to vanish.